House of the Dragon Season 2 Episode 3 is a bit weird. And by that I mean more than just saying, oh, Rhaenyra going full Assassin's Creed to sneak into the Sept and speak to Alicent. That's a bit ridiculous. Because I don't think it's entirely ridiculous. I think there are good and bad aspects about that writing decision. It's not so clear cut. However, there are aspects about this episode as a whole that leave me a little confused, let's say. But let's begin at the beginning, because we open with the Brackens and the Blackwoods having a very schoolboy confrontation with each other that sharply escalates into a burned landscape littered with bodies. I love this as an opening. As ever, the House of the Dragon isn't the most subtle. I think I'm coming to accept that, but to appreciate that sometimes you don't need to be. This episode has to establish the contested politics around the Riverlands. This is an event that happens and signals the beginning of the war. Why not cold open with the classic feud between these two houses? Why not present that feud as expressed through young and hot-headed figures who are technically arguing about the position of some old stones? At its core, it's fundamentally ridiculous. And then immediately a ton of people lose their lives, even though no king or queen instructed them to do anything here. It's not subtle, but it shouldn't be. War is brutal, and that fact should be thrown right in our faces here to say, look at this. It's quick, it's concise, it expresses everything we need to learn here. And you know, there is some slight contradiction I'm feeling is growing as we go along, because Season 2 of House of the Dragon was marketed as a kind of pick a side type situation. We had separate trailers for the Greens and the Blacks, which side do you support, incite fandom discussion on both sides of a camp. Marketing wise, I think that is genius to build appeal, but it's also strange when the themes of the actual show are kind of that neither side is correct. As Rhaenys even states this episode,
soon they will not even remember what it was that began the war in the first place.
Why this war started, who was right and wrong. Soon none of that will matter. It will just be death and destruction, and whoever happens to limp out just about still alive from the wreckage, they'll just be the victor, and everyone else, especially the common folk, will have suffered horribly. So I don't know, I don't think this is deliberate, but in that context it's starting to feel like the Blackwoods and the Brackens are the fandom here, and the show is saying, look at this, audience, this is where it can lead. Look how easy it is to manipulate people into fighting amongst each other. And I don't know whether to criticise that idea or to compliment it, but either way, yes. Episode 3 continues a tradition of presenting a clear theme to explore for the episode. Largely, I think we can define this one as armies on the move. Once they've started marching, they are slow and will take time, but they are nonetheless in motion now. It's not altogether easy to stop them again and have them march back home. I'm speaking more metaphorically there, but I think it makes sense. Almost like a well-structured essay, we begin this episode with an introduction. The Blackwoods and the Brackens destroy themselves over a feud they can't even remember the start of, nor really care. This is a smaller kind of foreshadowing point about the Greens and the Blacks. Then we see armies on the move readying for similar destruction. Rhaenys presenting the argument to avert that destruction, imploring Rhaenyra, and we see her then teetering on both sides of the argument, until she grieves to have to send her sons away, leading her to finally read Alicent's letter, and then she tries. Then we get this desperate last-ditch attempt to avoid the horrors that are certain to follow, but then our conclusion is that it's already too late. Already it doesn't actually matter why they are fighting or who is right or if there has been a mistake. They are just fighting regardless now. They cannot be called back. Does Aegon or Aemond or Daemon really care who the old and dying Viserys named as his heir? All three of them arguably care much more about looking strong and feeling strong and getting to make a difference in some way. I think Criston cares about proving his worth in a position most don't think he deserves. They also all care much more about Lucerys and Jaehaerys' deaths than what Viserys thought. The interesting thing about history is that it is almost always difficult to pin down when exactly a war started to one specific event. There's always lots people can debate about which is the defining moment, and we get that again here with the general conclusion that it doesn't actually matter which moment or what started it, and in concept I do really like that. So what's the problem? Well, it's twofold. The first, I think, is to do with momentum. that's what we're about to discuss after I, you know...
You saved my life.
What is the life of a queen worth these days?
You wish to be rewarded.
As I would think, you would wish to reward me.
What price would you set?
51% off a subscription to World Anvil.
One turn for another, then.
World Anvil. Yep, they sponsored this video, they're still here, hopefully they'll stay here. World Anvil is an online tool for building worlds, creating characters, designing and managing campaigns for a whole slew of games. Slew isn't the right word, I don't know why I said that. Look, you can do all that, you can plan and write stories, you can do all sorts of different stuff for creative projects. I use it for the world building of my novel because my old system of massive Word documents became far too chaotic. Not only does the ability to create timelines with hyperlinks branching off to specific characters or articles or a billion other things, not only does that make it so much easier to quickly find the information I need, it also makes it so much easier to plan things out and kind of keep going. Sometimes a blank Word document for world building is very daunting, so having all sorts of tools to help with visualization, to help you figure out what needs planning next, to keep your brain fizzing and unimpeded, because all of the tools are very straightforward and easy to use. That's really important to me. It's like the sharper an artist's pencils, the freer they are to focus on the art. World Anvil is a very sharp pencil. You can create mind maps, you can rearrange elements of your story, do all sorts of campaign related things for that slew of games I mentioned. Yes, link in the description and as a pinned comment should you desire a 51% discount on all their subscriptions, or if you're not yet sure, then try out the free version for as long as you like. That's what I did at first, and now look where I am, shouting their name at you through a screen. World Anvil!
The problem is that this theme does have us somewhat retreading old ground. You know, the army's now in motion, kind of out of your control, sort of recycles the idea at the end of the last season.
The idea that we control the dragons is an illusion.
It is kind of a similar idea again now. I praised the show last episode for not just diving immediately into battle. You know, Jaehaerys was killed, the next episode could have just been cut to war. But no, they explored the more complex fallout and how grief affects family that should pull together and yet are just a mess of many difficult dynamics. That was great, they took their time. Now we need to explore Rhaenyra's side, and it feels slightly like a step back here. Rhaenyra's doing a bit of a hokey cokey. You know, at the end of last season her son was killed and then she was livid. And now a lot of that fury is gone again. Rhaenyra is instead hesitant about her counsellor's suggestions of war. She's not exactly eager at first, but she does then speak to Alicent. She wants to avoid conflict altogether. And then at the end we kind of finish this episode sort of where she started, in a kind of half fury to go to war again. Sort of. I mean, psychologically I think this episode makes sense with Rhaenyra, because she did never really want to go to war. She describes the dragons this episode as a weapon of fear. She wanted to amass enough support and pose enough of a threat that the Greens would have to back down, or could be defeated with as little fight as possible, because she doesn't want the death and she saw herself as the morally right side. She concluded that people will support her, she is the rightful heir, it's as simple as that, only it's not been. And then Aemond killed Lucerys. That brought out a rage, but for Aemond specifically. Daemon was Daemon's, and now Jaehaerys' blood, her fault or not, is seen to be on Rhaenyra's hands. And now she is not so morally righteous as a result. Even her own council thought she might have done that. Winning this argument, this almost war, is no longer just a matter of being right. Plus, Sir Eric almost kills her, and she thinks of Jaehaerys and fears for her own children now, sees how vulnerable they all are, and suddenly the idea of war is huge and scary and incredibly close. Both her and Alicent have at times been willfully blind to the horrors they've been flirting on the edges of, but now it's frighteningly real. And even though she did already lose Lucerys, this time Rhaenyra reacts with fear, not fury, because her fury about Lucerys achieved nothing but weakening her own position. So now we get the last desperate attempt of two sides who have not wanted war. So I do think all of that makes sense, and it is interesting to explore. However, momentum-wise, for the story and its overall structure, I think it feels something has grinded to a halt briefly. I imagined a lot of people might complain about the pacing last episode, but I argued how brilliant a job Tom Glencarney and Rhys Ifans do as Aegon and Otto. I argued that that counteracted a lot of the long, slow time they were taking to set up future plot lines. But it's harder to make that argument with episode 3. We've also kind of sidelined everything that was being set up in the last episode. You know, they were building to something with Hugh and Baylor and Alan, and even arguably what Otto does next. But now we've put all of that stuff on hold, grinding that to a halt to instead start setting up Ulf and Gwaine and Rhaena and this lady I've been told is called Alice. We've also still not had any questions raised about who Aegon's heir is now. So I think this episode has good structure and pacing in itself, but in terms of the wider season and the wider story structure, it feels a little bit out of place. It feels like it's killed off some of that momentum. And it's not to say the idea of this episode doesn't work, because I think it could. I think at its best, this episode would feel like events in the background spiraling wildly out of control, and then Rhaenyra making one last attempt to prevent it, but it's too late now. That is kind of what they're gone for, but it doesn't feel like enough is spiraling wildly out of control for that idea to be executed well enough. That's my first criticism. What is my second one? Yeah, it's the decision itself for Rhaenyra to sneak into King's Landing and meet Alicent. I don't much like it, but let's be fair to the idea, because on the one hand, it is kind of good. We know the Sept is where Alicent goes. That's been established really well in the past. It means the two sitting down again as they used to here when they were young. It means we do have the two central figures who are at the heart of this story getting to have a confrontation before the war. It means we get to explore the themes here in a clear and quite a concise way. You know, Alicent realising she was fundamentally wrong, she misunderstood Viserys, but no, it doesn't matter now. Things have already been set in motion. She has no choice but to try and deny that and to hold fast to the action she's already made. Our final shot is a resolved Rhaenyra now, feeling there is truly no choice but to fight, that Alicent won't back down even when the truth has been shown. I imagine as a result we're not going to see Rhaenyra hesitate after this moment, so all of that is technically good. The problem is, we've now had 3 episodes in a row where people sneak into dangerous places in a somewhat rash manner. Blood and Cheese snuck into the Red Keep and it was a foolhardy plan that mostly went wrong. Sir Eric snuck into Dragonstone and it was an absolutely ridiculous plan that went wrong. Daemon infiltrating Harrenhal made more sense, but it does repeat a similar action sequence, and then Rhaenyra sneaks into the Sept. And after you've painted Sir Eric's move as clearly ridiculous, I think it's hard to present this decision as a sensible one. Let's not forget this episode also had Aegon wanting to ride into battle and it then being argued, no, the king shouldn't put himself at risk. So to have Rhaenyra putting herself at risk, I do think this decision does put a strain on the reality of the show. I don't think it's so wildly ridiculous as to be laughable, and it's not a terrible idea, it's not stupid or bad writing. There is sense to this, but I just don't feel convinced by it. Especially when it does repeat the someone sneaks into somewhere dangerous sequence that we're now seeing a lot. I think even that repetition itself slows the momentum of this story because it makes it feel like we're kind of going in circles. So yeah, I think on the basis of that criticism, I would say this is the worst episode of the season so far, but it's not all bad. So here's just some quicker other things to chuck out. I did really love Harrenhal this episode. I think the castle is the standout character for this episode. Beautifully atmospheric, conveys the haunted, magical quality that Game of Thrones often downplays too much. Again, I didn't feel the dream sequence was the most subtle, but I still love it's there, and I love seeing Daemon's vulnerability creep up. He also generally looks very afraid in Harrenhal. He was super daring when he fought taught the crab feeder, pumped up with adrenaline, wanting to look heroic before an audience, but contained in the darkness on his own. We see some of that facade falling, and the man's getting older, and then he meets someone who I imagine is inducing this dream and tells him he's going to die here. I also just really like the sort of subversion, but also most sensible ending here, that this creepy sequence building up all sorts of tension, and then you just open the door and it's basically an old man going, "Oh, hello, the castle is yours," and then apologising for not having any red currant for the venison. I think all of the Harrenhal scenes are very strong. Pun intended. I like seeing Daemon's conflict. Is this a bold action to prove his loyalty to Rhaenyra, or is it to prove why he would make a great king? He makes them swear to Rhaenyra, but he demands to be addressed as your grace. I don't know why Gwaine is here and what he's going to build to, but I like his characterization, and I like getting to see that, yeah, Criston Cole is not going to be a good hand, but he is still a capable enough military commander. And for everything I've said about the lack of subtlety, I do like the subtlety we get between him and Alicent. Neither have talked on screen about the fact he's replaced her father as Hand of the King. All of their conversations this episode exist in subtext, and that's good. It makes me feel more positive about their intimate scene that ended episode 2. At the time I think it felt underwhelming as an ending to that episode, but now it's a good marker to show their subtle shift in dynamic. Alicent was the one with the power who controlled when and how they had sex, and then it's suddenly Criston. Another big tick for subtlety I think is Larys Strong. He's actually possibly been my favourite thing about this season so far, just hovering in the background, affecting everything, growing in power, building to something. Larys is unsettling, but he's not too much in the foreground here. They hint just the right amount with him. You know, I also said last episode that when someone's primary motivation is to not look weak, it makes them both very predictable and easy to manipulate. Aegon, of course, wants to go to war because he wants to look strong. How do you stop him going? Larys just suggests that he'll look weak if he goes because his mother will get to rule in his absence. Job done. I felt Ulf this episode was fine, less shoehorned in than he could have been, although I found it a bit much how everyone was calling out to him like he's their best friend. You know, generally I said last episode that the show is planting seeds for the future, and then all of you in the comments went, "Oh, seeds, you don't know how right you are." And now we get to this episode and this guy uses the phrase dragon seed, and like, you weren't as discreet as you thought you were being there, comment section. I think I've inferred what's going to happen now. Aegon discovers Aemond with the Madam, and I feel for Aemond in that moment. He chose to act casual, to deliberately stand tall, hiding nothing, both literally and metaphorically, and just walk right out before all of them. I don't know where it's going exactly between Aemond and Aegon this show, but the dynamic between them continues to be interesting. And also, some of you pointed out to me that this madam was in the first season, and that Aegon took Aemond to her to lose his virginity when he was only 13, which I'd completely forgotten, and does somewhat reframe the way I view Aemond's dynamic with her. It makes me think when this season is done, it could be worth discussing that in a video on its own. But yes, I think I'd give this episode less in ranking than whatever the hell I ranked the first one. And I don't know what's going on in the fandom because I tend to just live under a rock when I go about my life, but if it's getting mad at Rhaenyra disguised as a scepter the way they got mad at like Rings of Power or most of Star Wars or whatever, then I think that's a stretch too far. Nuance is a thing. We can be critical of parts of a show without it making the writers devoid of intelligence and the entire show garbage, in my opinion. But what's yours? Like the video if you liked it, subscribe, maybe even support me on Patreon or buy me a coffee, but otherwise, hopefully see you next time. And as ever, a special thank you goes to Flying Spider, Grace, Kellyanne Davidson, Luke Hoare, Michael Gallagher, Chad Bramwell and Joshua C. Follier. Thank you.